Good morning, my friends. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, help us to feel your living presence within us. Help us to know that all the great masters and all the saints are surrounding us with their enlightening consciousness. Help us to understand the purpose of our lives and to have the courage and the clarity and the devotion to live according to this highest calling. We are your children. Bless us and guide us. Om. Peace. Amen. All right. So we are continuing. I'm holding up this piece of paper, which we will eventually make available as a PDF on our, in addition, attached to these recordings. We are working with what it means to expand your consciousness, and I've been working on this for several days, and it's going to go on for several sessions longer. This progression of consciousness, which interestingly is related to the caste system of India, because the caste system of India was handed down from ancient times, and in ancient higher ages it was a perception of the progression of human awareness. It gradually became, in the darkening yuga of Kali Yuga, which has just ended, it became an instrument for social oppression, but that's not what it is. It's just a perception that human awareness proceeds along predictable lines as we gradually move from contracted to expanded awareness. And if we can understand what that flow of enlightenment actually is, then it's easier for us to assess our own the word I want to use is level, but our own level of awareness. It's also easier for us to assess which way is forward. And when we really integrate it deeply, it gives us a marvelous template for knowing how to motivate others in such a way that that motivation will actually be received and can be acted upon. So I cannot really overemphasize how helpful this understanding is. I've been living according to this model for many decades, and I find it extraordinarily helpful in working with myself and equally helpful in working with others. So I'm recommending it from experience. So the four stages: morally asleep, self-centered, truth-seeking, and truth-sharing. We are 3/4 of the way through a description of what the self-centered stage is, and that is the stage that is commonly called Vaishya in the caste system. And Vaishya means a merchant, and it's an archetype. It doesn't mean that every merchant is a Vaishya, is self-centered, or that everyone who's self-centered is a merchant. It's an archetype, because the archetype of a merchant is that they're perfectly willing to give as long as it's a fair deal and they also get. And this, of course, becomes meaningful when we shift to the next stage, which is truth-seeking, where what I get becomes less the issue. See, so all of these work together as one contrast to another. You see how the flow of energy goes, and the concept of it being a judgment or condemnation fades away, because we really just see this as a natural progression. Because to be self-centered is a step up from being too lazy to put out energy for any reason. So to get a sort of healthy selfishness, self-concern, where I really will work as long as there's something in it for me, is better than just not putting out any energy at all. But then in the process of putting out that energy, because of some kind of personal gain that I'm going to get, what happens is people begin to experience the satisfaction of simply putting out energy. So the fact that the motivation may be more self-centered than it will be later as our awareness expands, at this stage it doesn't matter, because the incentive causes us to put out energy. Energy has its own intelligence, and it begins to teach us. Now all of this, bear in mind, is all about karma and reincarnation. And when I finish with this whole section, we'll come back and begin to tie it all together, and you'll really see how fundamental this template is to a rational understanding of what karma is. Because people rebel against karma because the concept even, because they don't see how it's progressive. And once you see how it's progressive and how the necessary incentives have to be in place, then a lot of people's rejection of the idea is tempered by a deeper understanding. So that's what we're working with here. So when each of these characteristics has what I call the basic attitude, the motivation for putting out energy, the response to suffering, and how we carry out our relationships with other people. So in the previous session, for the Vaishya self-centered level, I said the basic attitude is looking out for oneself. What's in it for me is the question that is often asked. And even you hear businessmen will just say that. Well, they'll be talking about something that could be done, and the businessman will say, well, what's in it for me? You know, what's my return on investment, my ROI? What do I get from this? And it's considered to be a perfectly natural way to be, and at that stage of life, it is a perfectly natural way to be. Tell me what's in it for me, and if it's good enough for me, I'll help you in it. When you get to truth sharing, to truth seeking and truth sharing, the motivation is entirely different. And so the motivation is, the basic attitude is what's in it for me, and the motivation, therefore, is some kind of personal gain. If there's something in it for me, I'll do it. And where I am now is on this question of response to suffering. Now bear in mind, at the level above, the morally asleep, the response to suffering is to avoid pain by deadening one's awareness. If I'm suffering, what I do is I dull myself down. I watch television, I drink alcohol, I take drugs, I overindulge in sense pleasures, I eat too much. I'm not interested in what's true. I'm not interested in self-improvement. If I'm suffering, I just dull myself down until I don't feel it. So such people are not introspecting and trying to understand how I can improve. And when you're dealing with a Shudra, a morally asleep person, you can't motivate them by the desire to grow. They don't have a desire to grow. Their response to suffering is not, how can I understand deeper and grow, which really comes into play when you're a truth seeker. It's just, how can I avoid pain by just making myself so dull that I don't feel it. The response to suffering for the Vaishya, for the self-centered person, is to avoid pain by controlling everything around me. I gain security from outward things, and so I need the outer world to behave in a certain way. So therefore I need money, I need security, I need ownership of things. Sometimes such people like really heavy things. I mean, they like big furniture, big houses, big cars. The more sort of physically present it is, the more they feel it gives them power over the outer world. Their definition of reality is the world around me, and therefore I need it to behave a certain way. And so this means that, you know, the people around you have to behave a certain way, your partner in life, your children. You have a great sense of the form and the propriety of things. This is how it's done. These are the rules. This is what we do. Because the way I avoid pain is making sure that my outer world matches. Such people are very interested in dogmatic religion. They believe that even with God, it's a deal. I give a certain amount to the church, I do certain prayers, I go to Mass every Sunday, I do certain rituals, I hire the pujaris to do exactly what they're supposed to do, and all of that, the world behaves a certain way, and that's how it's going to work for me. It's also very interesting and a little distressing to think about a great deal of political action, even though it's motivated from perhaps a compassionate attitude toward impoverished people or ill people or disempowered people. There is an element of idealism in it. But often there's also a very strong Vaishya element in it, which is the world around me is not behaving as it should. If I can make it behave the way I think it is, I will feel better. Now, you see, that's progressive from Shudra. That's progressive from just who cares about anything. I'm just going to be a lump. It's a step forward, but there's still this flaw in the way that we're thinking, because the problem is we can't control the world around us. And so if our reaction to suffering and if our way of mitigating our own suffering is to make the outer world behave the way we want it to, sooner or later we're going to discover that that simply doesn't work. You have death, you have natural cataclysms, you have human action. You have governmental regimes that suddenly turn and massacre individuals, and you could have thought that you were integrated in society and you were well respected and it would never happen, and then there's a regime change and something really terrible starts being implemented against you or others. And if you want, everybody to be treated righteously in this world, and you have very selfish people who have power, then your efforts to make those powerful people behave in the way they ought to, it's not that it's not perhaps even an uplifted intention. It's just not a practical one, because the world is simply not going to behave. At the stage of development this world is on, and many souls who are working out different kinds of karma. And see, this is where we begin to run into the karmic story, because every soul is progressing through these different stages. This is how consciousness expands. And every single individual works their way through these various stages, and as I've said several times, not neatly. It's like we're this quality, we're at this stage in one area, we're advanced here, we're retarded in this one. And every agent, every jiva on the planet is acting out their own karma, and we're interacting with each other because this is the appropriate thing that we need. Because one of the things that we need to learn, because self-centered is only the second level of 4 progressive stages, is that if we're going to try to avoid suffering by getting the world to conform to our idea of what it ought to be, it's not going to work. And if it doesn't work, then we're going to continue to suffer. And unfortunately, the way we learn is when our attempts to comfort ourselves and make ourselves safe fail. And they fail, and this is where reincarnation comes into the story. The divine plan is that we get to have as much experience as we need in order to have the lesson really sink deeply into us. Now, this is not really, it doesn't require reincarnation for this to be true. Just reflect, if you can reflect honestly on the life experiences you've had so far, just in this incarnation, and you will see that you made efforts. I'm talking about how to, the basic attitude is how we find happiness, and the response to suffering is how we avoid pain. And just think about how you've probably already in your life tested out and progressed through a certain number, a certain amount of what I'm describing right here. Even to avoid suffering by simply dulling our consciousness. Whether we've been through alcoholism or drug addiction or sugar addiction or just pure laziness or video game addiction or too much television, too much sensuality, all of these things, we've had some experience that says, I tried it and it didn't work. So now we're trying to make others match our beliefs of what they're supposed to be, or we're trying to make God match our beliefs of what we're supposed to be. I have given you so much money to the church, you know, my wife shouldn't die. But my wife dies, even though I pray that she doesn't. So the first thing we can do is just be enraged, which is another way of, dealing with, anger is another way to dull our awareness and not have to really confront. We just become angry. And that way we don't suffer anymore because we've rejected. It's one of the ways of just bringing our consciousness down. I'm not going to think more philosophically. I'm not going to expand my awareness. I'm just going to dull it with anger. So I'm just angry at God. So then we get to have a lot of incarnations where how does that work for you? Where I just reject any higher reality. But the foundation of it is I was controlling fate by doing the things that my church or my temple or my pujari told me to do, and it didn't work. But see, it's not that it doesn't work, it's that's the beginning of understanding that the response to suffering, that I'm going to control the world around me, that's the flaw. That's the flaw. Because we begin to understand that all we ever have mastery over is our inner consciousness. That we simply can't control everyone around us. When this level of consciousness is taken into the field of relationships, the relationships become symbiotic, which is to say we'll just trade. We'll serve each other's needs, but it'll be a constant trade. It's not going to be generous. It's not going to be, that I'll give to you. It's the same question. What's in it for me? If there's something in it for me, I'm willing to give to you. And so we just trade favors. I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, but I won't unless you do. So we're always just trading like that. In many people's relationships, you see, here are the chores, these are mine, these are yours. Everything is just always has to be fair. If I'm going to give, you have to give. And that's the way it works out. How does that make you happy? How does that avoid suffering? You behave in a certain way, but if you change, then, and so gradually though, we begin to move out of this second stage of being self-centered and the basic attitude being what's in it for me. And we begin to move into the third stage, which would be called the Kshatriya stage in the caste system. And the archetype there is the soldier, and ideally the king. It's hard to say that because the idea of the king or the leadership now is considered to be so self-centered. But the ideal of the king is that the king is there entirely and only to serve the people. But the soldier is more clear, because the soldier has ideals to which he has devoted his life. He sacrifices his comfort and trains very hard and is willing even to give up his life to serve and to save others because he believes in the ideal. Now, once again, don't get caught in the details. I mean, some people may feel that, violence is not right or nationalism is not a proper ideal, but it's what it brings out of the individual. So that can be, your ideal can be a spiritual ideal, your ideal can be a love for others ideal, where you give up your own comforts and go live in very hard circumstances in order to uplift others, that you might even go into dangerous circumstances in order to save and uplift others. So that is the ideal of the truth seeker. Now I am motivated. The basic attitude of the truth seeker is not what's in it for me. The basic attitude is what is true and how can I serve that truth. And of course, if you want to really think about it, it's still also for self, but the self-satisfaction now comes not from what I can get for my own comfort, but how clearly I can live by the ideals I understand, and how can I serve that ideal in the world around me. So the basic characteristic of the truth-seeking soul, the stage of consciousness, of conscious development, is that we see that there's a reality bigger than my own life, and that we ponder the meaning of it all. The Vaishya is thinking only about what I can get. He's not thinking about the implications of his action for the whole. He just thinks, what can I get? How can I control the world around me? How can I aggrandize myself? And how I make myself secure is that I force the world to conform. The truth-seeking soul realizes that, wait a minute, I'm part of a much greater energy here, and I can't operate just in a vacuum. I have to think about what the meaning of everything I do is in relationship to this greater whole. The truth-seeking soul also begins to discover the joy of giving to others, that there's a greater joy in giving to others than there is in merely fulfilling my own desires. And so instead of just like, well, Swami Kriyananda talks about, he was sitting at his family dinner table one night. This was after he was long established as a spiritual leader on his own. He was just visiting his family and his relatives who lived at a higher, relatively high economic level. Swami just, in some context, made the comment, imagine earning so much money and just spending it on yourself. Meaning, imagine what an unfortunate and preposterous thing that would be to do. And other relatives at his table said, my, that's an unusual perspective. I guess Swami just forgot where he was for a moment. And his family they were good people. But that's an unusual perspective. And Swami's thought was, well, what other perspective could there be? You know, the Vaishya thinks I have lots of money, I'll get a really big house and a yacht and 14 big cars, and just like the more money I have, the more I'll buy, and that's what'll make me happy. The truth-seeking person thinks, how can I use my resources to help others? And it's much more gratifying for them to think about using what they've created to uplift than it is just to indulge. So and the reason one begins to feel that way, you have to understand this, is from the experience, from the actual experience of what it feels like to give. I remember a friend of mine who had a lot of resources to share. It sort of began to occur to him. I don't want to identify him because I don't want to embarrass him, but he was a merchant, and he dealt with fairly expensive things, but not luxury items, just essentials that were fairly expensive. And it occurred to him that he could afford to give away, some of what he would normally sell. And I remember him saying to me how happy it made him to give some of his product away. And he said it sort of like this was an amazing discovery to him, that seeing how others who needed what he had received it just made him so happy that he wanted to give away more. And it was like, yes, good boy, that's exactly right. Because we are made a certain way. So this whole progression of consciousness, which I'm describing now, what does it mean to expand your consciousness, is not a dogma. It's an explanation of how we are made. And it is a discovery that we were born to make. But because we're slow learners, and because experiences have to be repeated many, many times before we tend to see the cause and effect relationship, this leads us to, and karma is just an unlearned lesson about the nature, about where happiness comes from, and what can we do to avoid suffering. That's what karma is, unlearned lesson about what brings us happiness and what brings us suffering. And what I'm describing here is the process by which we learn what gives us happiness and what gives us suffering. So the Vaishya gets really powerful, usually with money, and then money brings power. Attachment to money is often attachment to power. The power to make the world just the way I want it. And then we try that. We try that in one lifetime is not enough. So we're drawn back to reincarnate because our unlearned lessons compel us. And when I get to the chakras portion of this, then I'll explain to you how that works. And that's what the chakras tell us is the mechanism through which karma is carried from lifetime to lifetime, and then how the chakras gradually shift as the lessons are learned. In other words, as the karma is worked out. So the Vaishya works hard enough, puts out enough energy to get enough money, enough power, enough personal power, because it's also vitality and magnetism, it's not just money, to actually conduct the experiment of making myself safe and free from suffering by controlling the world. And then we find out that it don't work. And when it don't work over and over again, we begin to ask a deeper question. What is the meaning of life? What is really going on here? And we begin to sense, perhaps first in the negative, but then gradually in the positive, that I am not a singleton. Even though my body is a single body, I seem to be operating in a field of energy that is bigger than just me, whether it's climate or government or whatever it is. I am part of a greater reality. And even death itself, which is a force that is completely beyond the ego mind to control, which leads us to questions of spirituality and God, then we begin to see that I am part of a greater reality. And that greater reality cannot be controlled from the perspective of my little ego. So we eventually begin to ask the question, what is reality? What is really going on here? And then we begin to discover that once I see myself as part of this greater reality, and I begin not merely to try to control so that I will feel better, but to actually give out of the sheer joy of giving. And then being willing to give up my own comfort, because far from causing me more suffering, it actually makes me feel freer and happier when I think more of the welfare of others than of myself. Now, once again, these are not obscure ideas. Just reflect through the experience of your own life. Your dedication to a pet, to a dog that's been very faithful to you. Your dedication to an ideal, something that is really important to you that you can bring to fruition. Your dedication to building a church, not so that God will owe you and then be sure and answer your prayers, but because of the wonderful joy it gives so many other people to be able to come and partake of that. And you realize that that joy of serving and helping others is far greater and far deeper than anything when I just get for myself. So that will be our thoughts for today, and we'll continue in our next session with the rest of this story. God bless you.